Welcome to the Eco and the ESPN Esports channels across social media. My name is Jacob Wolf, and I am your host. This is our weekly Counter-Strike Global Offensive show, and thank you for joining us. We got a lot in store for you throughout this show. I want to do a little bit of talk about betting in Counter-Strike. This is actually something we're going to be expanding into a little bit more, having various different experts that understand lines, particularly as bigger events come later down the road. And also, we have an interview that we did earlier today, which we had to pre-record because our guest is European, and it is very late in Europe right now. If you're a European, thanks for staying up to watch this with us. But nonetheless, we spoke to Nicolas Estrup, who is the head of product at Blast, the tournament organizer, about what it was like to put together the Blast premiere this past weekend and how his team coordinated in Denmark, actually, together in person, which I think a lot of Americans, myself included, that's a little surprising that they're able to do that amid this pandemic. But he said things are sort of lightening up in Denmark overall, which they certainly are not here in America. But, you know, we also talked a little bit about what happened this past weekend with a round restart between MIBR and Furia. I found comments that he made around not wanting to have a player take to social media really interesting, and sort of that influence more generally. And we're going to end off this show tonight talking a little bit about Astralis. And recently there was a long-form report from Richard Lewis in which he looked at some allegations that he had heard about Astralis regarding pay cuts and burnout and player treatment. And if you know anything about the show or you watched for a long time, one, we appreciate you being here, but we've also had Casper Witt on this show, who is the director of sport at the Astralis Group. And if what Richard is reporting is true, which I think I trust Richard fairly frequently with what he writes. Certainly, I think I don't think Casper was being particularly disingenuous with us, but I certainly think there were things that were not being said. And so I do want to talk a little bit about that, some of my thoughts on what Richard wrote, and also sort of where this leaves us with Astralis, obviously one of the best teams historically in Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and where they're going to go from here. But first, let's talk about CS Summit. CS Summit actually started earlier today on Monday. And while there are very limited areas to bet in this event, Betway is actually offering lines to do so. So far, it's mostly been on the qualifier. I believe they're taking bets on a daily basis. You can bet ahead for Wednesday in the case of Europe. But I want to look ahead because the show is weekly, and we are not going to have the opportunity to talk to you before what will be the group stage, particularly of the European side of the bracket. And just looking at this and thinking about sort of performance that's been happening over the past couple of weeks, we know really surprising result, by the way, at Blast, the fact that Complexity, of all teams, won Blast Premier for Europe. Shout outs to Jason Lake, one of the sort of early veterans of our scene who's been here for a long time, and the really emotional message that he said on the Blast stream. But looking, even without all the qualifier results ironed out, I'm looking at Group A as something that, from a betting perspective, is really interesting. Obviously, you have G2 Esports, who in RMR rankings at least are second, and they're one of the highest performing teams in all of Europe, and they have been over the past few months across multiple events. But Mousesports is there, and we don't even know who the fourth team is yet. And no matter who comes out of the European qualifier, I'll be really curious to see who gets placed up in there from the last part of the knockout stage. To recap who's there, it's Fnatic and Pact, who play tomorrow, Complexity and Contact, who play tomorrow, and then they will play in a fifth place knockout game for the qualifier tomorrow morning. I don't know about you, but any of those teams sound like that's going to make this group really heavy if any of them get shuffled into there. CS Summit has not really thoroughly explained their qualifying system, at least for how the qualifier feeds into the main tournament. But Group A kind of looks like a group of death, and therefore, from a betting perspective, if you feel like you're having fun, you may be able to bet on something like Godsent and be able to walk away with some good cash. And so overall, I think the European competition is a little bit more interesting from a betting perspective. I think the North American competition, to me at least, seems like there's really only three teams that really have a shot at this from a consistency perspective. I think that's Team Liquid, Evil Geniuses, and Furia. Every other team in this event so far has been really inconsistent over the past few months, but those are the three that have really stood out. But Europe is in this weird flux, and I'm sure we'll get to this with a little bit of Astralis. They're obviously not playing in this event. But in the case of who is the top European Counter-Strike team in the state of online Counter-Strike play, we don't really know the answer to that. That's really interesting to me. You have teams like G2, you have teams like Vitality, who are, and even like Mouse and Fnatic, and now apparently Complexity, who on any given day can win an event. We've seen success from teams like Big as well. And I can't help but think that there are other teams that want this shot too. We've heard about FaZe sort of having some issue with Olaf Meister stepping down, also citing burnout in that case. But there are other teams on the rise, like Ninjas and Pajamas too. So when I look at the competition here, I can only think that Europe is a little bit more in flux. And from a betting market perspective, that's really interesting. So I'll be curious to sort of see what the lines is. We're going to be talking about this over the next couple of weeks. We hope every single week to make it a part of our show. I think the betting in esports generally is growing, and I think that Counter-Strike is a big part of that. We actually did, though, see that some of the sportsbooks here in North America, at least in the States, were withdrawing from esports betting. William Hill backed out this past weekend. But I don't think that's the trend, and I think particularly with such a big European audience, Counter-Strike is really interesting from a betting perspective. And I think once we're all out of coronavirus and the pandemic, that betting will return to normal and people have additional money to spend when they're back able to go back to work. And I think that Counter-Strike will be a big part of that. But before we talk about Astralis, which I'm sure people are interested in hearing what I have to say, I do want to throw to this interview we did with Nicolas Estrup. I hope that you find it interesting. So here we go with our interview with Nicolas Estrup. We now welcome on Nicolas Estrup with one of the, I guess you're technically a founder of Blast, right? When I met you, Blast wasn't even a thing. So you were at Refresh. You were one of the early guys. I guess what is your official title of at Blast at this point?
My official full fancy smancy title is Director of Product and Experience. Yes. And I think to your point, yeah, I guess I am one of the founding fathers, if you want, of Blast, and it's been a wild ride. You know, I've worked on Blast ever since its inception, where that's what I focused on throughout the split of the companies and everything. So here we are. Crazy ride.
Well, we appreciate you joining us and staying up late. I will note in the actual show, but this is pre-recorded just because we want to be fair to our European friends joining us on this call because it's a late night show in America. But nonetheless, we appreciate you joining us and taking the time. And after a successful weekend of competition, nonetheless, as you mentioned on the pre-call, that we had the American team in Europe and then actually an American team winning both Blast premieres. So that's an interesting result nonetheless. But what I wanted to talk to you about was sort of the organization of this, because something about Counter-Strike that is unique amid the COVID-19 pandemic is that there isn't one singular organizer like Riot Games in the case of League of Legends or some of the others. It's an open community, and there are really 3 or 4 big tournament organizers running events right now, and nobody really has one surefire way of doing it. So how was this weekend as an experience? I guess we'll start there. How did this weekend go relative to your expectations from, I guess, the back end perspective?
Well, I think all in all, very happy with the output, right? I think we had the, I want to say, fortunate situation of not having an event immediately at the beginning of the whole COVID situation. So it bought us some time for us to see what could be done, see what others did in the space, and then try to figure out where and how we could try to push some boundaries and raise the bar for what's possible. And I think a lot of those things that we wanted to do when we started 3 weeks ago, we've had Counter-Strike 1 week, Dota another, and then Counter-Strike again, back to back. I think what we had kind of envisioned going into it pretty much worked, which isn't always how it goes. But in this instance, actually worked pretty much across the board. Everything from getting camera feeds from the teams at home to fan cams joining via Zoom calls, trying to take all these online boundaries down was kind of the most important task we had at hand.
Uniquely, you guys don't have your, at least as far as I'm aware, your own internal matchmaking platform like Faceit or ESL, who owns CSCA. So what have you been using to sort of put, I guess, that part of it together from a server perspective?
We've worked with Faceit ever since day one almost. So they were the ones that help us run the very first ever tournament. and has been with us ever since. So we've had a great relationship with them. Normally, right, when we're in a big arena, they're on site. They send 2 or 3 people, and they sit as part of our tournament ops team that help all of it run. But now, obviously, they're doing that from home. But as we know, they do what they do very well. So we trusted that completely, and it showed, I guess.
In terms of staffing, how did this weekend look like? Where was everyone spread out? How were people commentating? What was like that feed in to create what ultimately became the broadcast that was put out on Twitch?
So we had the main part of the production sitting in Denmark, Copenhagen, where I am now as well. Denmark is fairly progressive and was one of the first countries to both lock down very hard to try to stop the spread back then. That also meant that we actually opened up fairly fast. But after a couple of months, right, they began to ease the restrictions. And now, when I look out my window now, looks like any other day. People are bathing in the sun, drinking wine on restaurants. It's just normal everyday life as you remember, even though, we're obviously still being mindful. But it meant that we could actually bring together what essentially was a 40 to 50 man production out of Copenhagen. We managed to get Maniac on site, Anders Blume on site. And that was pretty much it from a talent perspective. That was, of course, to make sure that should everything, go south, then we can always cut to these two for stability, right? And just making sure that the show continued. But what lived in the Copenhagen production was those two capacities, one analyst, one caster, and then full in-game production. We had a television truck, full television production. And then we just managed, a tsunami of video feeds coming in from all over the world, right? It was a bit mind-boggling to think about that Anders and Moses was commentating from the US and Denmark, a match that is observed by DJ at another place in the US with cinematic observers and secondary observers sitting in Copenhagen. It's when you begin to understand all of that, you're looking at like, what have we done? Like, how is this even possible? But I think that's the beauty of, like you said, both esports and Counter-Strike. So that was pretty much the split. I think that the biggest challenge was just handling the massive amounts of video feeds. Normally when we do our big shows, we manage 30 video feeds maximum. Here we had 500 plus.
Wow.
So it was fairly extreme.
In terms of any sort of delay, obviously you're dealing with there's an ocean between your main production room in Copenhagen and DJ being the primary observer, Prius being the primary observer here in the US, and obviously you mentioned Moses casting remotely too. And from a delay perspective, were you hitting any hiccups from any sort of lag, presumably from a ping perspective?
Well, I think not necessarily on ping. There obviously was some internet connection issues in the Furia MIBR match particularly, which I think ended up being faulty internet on their side. There's been rumors on DDoSing. I don't know if we've seen evidence of that per se. I think there's been some internet issues in general in the US past couple of days when we broadcasted. But when it came to the wider production and latency between Anders and Moses as an example, and the people on the desk who obviously also spread all over Europe and the US, we didn't really see much. I think what was the hardest part was for them to just get in the rhythm of when it makes sense to talk. I think that's the hardest one. We're dealing with so little latency, but it's still enough to make a conversation awkward if you can't find each other properly. So just to give an example with Anders and Moses, Anders in the production actually had a side screen next to him just showing Moses the entire time, so that he knew when they were casting, when he was about to end a sentence, you do that kind of with your body when you're talking. So that made it somewhat easier to manage. It was more of that actually, just figuring out how do we create a normal conversation when people can't really just turn and look at each other.
From a team connectivity perspective, I mean, what did you expect coming into this that ultimately you were going to have some teams that had issues? I mean, not everything's standardized like it is maybe in some other games.
Well, definitely. I think we definitely knew that the US was going to be the hardest just because of sheer distance and placements of service, placements of teams, right? You had Furia sitting on the East Coast. You had almost everyone else sitting on West Coast, right? It couldn't be further apart. All it took was someone going to Hawaii, I think, to get even further apart. So it's already there. It's kind of crazy just from a technical point of view. So what we did and what we did leading up to it is constantly doing tech tests, but also server tests. So all the teams were enticed and pushed to, come on early in the days leading up to it, test various servers. I think it might have been the MIBR Furia one where we also just jumped servers from city to city to figure out what worked the best. And it as well, right? Sometimes on one day the techniques and all the technicalities around it look best on one location, and then for whatever reason it's better on another the other day. And I think that's just to some degree the randomness of connectivity now and again. But I think that was the hardest part to manage. But we knew that and felt like we did everything that we could, at least, and that we do normally, to make sure that we test a ton before going live.
On the note of the MIBR Furia match, you all did have a game stop and then a round restart. I read DK's fairly short, albeit critical column of the situation where your admin had to make that call, but let the players actually speak up and sort of voice their opinion on what they wanted to do. That is a little abnormal, so I'm sort of curious from your perspective, overseeing all of that, why that was done and sort of if you think that was the right call.
Well, so I think it's obviously led by our tournament ops team, right? And if you look at traditional sports, there's referees making calls every single day, right? And they can't be 100% accurate in every single decision. But I think in this decision, in the moment that they were in, I think they made the right call. And I think Mihail, an admin that we've used plenty of times, he works a lot with ESL and others as well, actually did an interesting thread on Twitter about it afterwards, because that rule, especially in an online place, is probably the hardest to manage, because you're dealing with, having so many different variables of how that rule could be applied. But what isn't a variable is that it always falls back to, integrity of the admin team on that day. So I think they made the right decisions with the informations that they had. I think, we always prefer that players don't take things to social media. And that's always something that we try to manage, but, can't always be in our control either when we can't see them physically in front of us. So that, I think, is back to it being online that all of a sudden becomes a factor.
So for the U.S. perspective, I mean, you described Denmark and what it's like there, but it is not good here for COVID-19. My county, actually, Travis County, Austin, Texas, just clamped back down on face masks and everything else again because people were going a little buck wild and cases were rising again. So from, and there is a from 6 to 9 hour time difference between the eastern part of the United States and the western part of the United States and Denmark. So from a production perspective, how did things work in the U.S. and how did those compare to what you were dealing with in Copenhagen?
Do you mean from a COVID point of view?
From like being able, you mentioned being able to bring people into a singular entity in Denmark and sort of all be together in a studio versus...
And how that not being possible.
Okay. Right, exactly.
Yeah. So I think when looking at setting up all of this, right, I think we obviously had plan A, B, C, D, and had a lot more plans for how this could play out. And I think the plan A initially was to try to see if we at least could get all the teams sitting together, right? Our dream for a setup was individual player cams down the line or wider shots of the team, right? So we had the full look at what they were doing, and also give the teams, the possibility of flexing with all these wild setups that there's being invested millions in, right? In their different office spaces or boot camp facilities. So that was like the dream. And of course, to your point just now, right? Every, county is different. Every state is different. It's like every country in Europe, right? Having different situations. So I think mindful of that, we just quickly reverted after discussing with the teams that was just not going to be possible, right? There are teams for whom it would be natural already, like MIBR, because they were already living together. But for others, we obviously asked if it was possible, but understood the no when that came, just because safety obviously comes first. So I think that just meant that we had to rework to figuring out how do we get individual cameras on everyone from home and them feeling fairly comfortable letting, a million viewer production into the comfort of their home. I think that was the biggest challenge in that.
And did the team that was working in Copenhagen together on the production side of things, did they stay up until the end of the American tournament to produce all of that also?
We had rotations on a lot of different positions just because it's obviously very long days. So we were mindful of that. And I think, The reason why I was there is, of course, to be there if fires erupt, but also just to keep morale up, keep making sure people have all the sugar, the fat, the food they could need to hydrate it. But no, we of course changed our key positions to make sure that they didn't, suffer too much.
So before we even had a prospect of what COVID-19 was, last year at an event, someone pulled out their phone and showed me a deck from Blast and sort of some of the big plans that you all had for this year. This was also before the Valve franchising post, in which they essentially said, if you make anyone wholly exclusive to your league, we will revoke your game license or potentially revoke your game license. And we could talk about that all day, but I do want to say something I'm curious about. That is how you guys didn't go ahead exactly with the plans, at least that I saw on the deck. Although you certainly had different variations. There are still nodes in Blast that are similar to what would be sort of a more concise league. We did see Flashpoint, though, and we did see ESL Pro League sort of alter and franchise in the sense of their schedules overlapped. So pre-COVID, some teams were only going to be able to play in one. Obviously, MIBR did both. But nonetheless, I want to ask that, like, if you would have gone ahead with doing the offline league that you wanted to do in that deck, what you were dreaming about, and then COVID-19 hit, how poorly do you think that would have affected your business, and how would things be different today?
That's obviously a big question, right? Because you're asking about something that, like you just noted on yourself, right? The vision of what we've wanted to achieve ever since inception, back in 2016 and 17 has changed a lot, right? And I think with all the movements that happened, we could just see more and more. Just to maybe talk on that to begin with, it just wasn't feasible to do it in a way where we felt like we were adding value to ourselves, to our teams, and to the ecosystem. I think if you went out and asked every single one of us individually, people were probably pretty fine with having all of it themselves, right? Any business would be foolish not to think that would be a pretty sweet deal, right? But I think you just can't have a setup like that fully when the ecosystem is the way it is, right? To your point exactly, it's easy when you're a Riot that has full rights to the game. You can do all the things you want, right? Same with other titles, and for them that makes sense. But we obviously have a very, very open ecosystem in Counter-Strike, so I think we just saw that plan was not going to work. Mm-hmm. So instead of trying to modify that and figure out how to do a shade of that, I think we just tried to flip it on its head and try to see how could we then begin creating value in making sure we had better narrative over the course of our tournament, but also something that might fit well into the ecosystem with what we, on a rumor basis, had heard that others were looking at, right? Like you mentioned, the Flashpoints, the ESL. I think the worst we could probably have done would be to come out with a very long league to go on top of two other very long leagues, right? that just made no sense. So I think I'm really happy we made that choice of shifting gears and resaddling the horse before taking it all public, and I felt like that was good. If then we would have not done that, to answer your other question, and we had hit COVID times, that would obviously have been rough, right? It's a very, very long format, and I don't envy all the other TOs who are venturing into this just like we did, and still trying to entertain the masses sitting at home. So yeah, no, I'm feeling pretty good about our setup also in online times.
We've seen a few smaller tournament organizers in Counter-Strike and cancel events altogether rather than pivot to online. And I can't help but think some of that's because they don't have the money to pull off what it would take to put together an online event. We've seen other businesses in esports really get hit hard by COVID as well. Many of them, though, with underlying financial issues that existed pre-COVID-19, and COVID-19 just kind of sped up the runway, or lowered the runway and shortened it. All that to ask, what do you think the Counter-Strike ecosystem looks like whenever COVID-19 calms down and we go back to whatever the new normal will be?
Well, I hope there is a new normal, right? Because I feel like there's so many key takeaways from what we've just experienced now with having essentially run 3 tournaments in a row, right? But all of them online in 2 different games, is that online can live in some capacity. And I think that's something that I hope we can begin looking more at. I'm not saying that online should rule it all, but in the hypothetical, let's say that we could have done our plan A, all the teams playing from the different facilities, haven't been able to get all of that edited together. They are still playing online, but are we then nearing something that is more reminiscent of being a somewhat of a land feeling, even though it's online? That to me is interesting, and to us. And I think, again, back to your point, looking at costs, right? It's no cheap endeavor going out and doing global events in big arenas, because ticket sales isn't what's gonna pave the road with gold in every city you come to. There's a ton of hard work going into partnerships, etc. So that's a big feat in itself. So I think, also just back to the narrative point, could we be in a situation where we could maybe have more online happening, but in a way where we actually get some of those LAN feelings into it, so that it can be taken a bit more serious to some degree, I guess, which I think is what the lack have been in the past. It's not looked upon as being truly competitive or truly serious. There's too many random outcomes. If we can get to a place where we don't have that, then I think that is both interesting for aspiring TOs who want to come in and do something, because they don't have to look at, huge costs on having everyone flown in, right? And,
Yep.
the more it grows, the more expensive it'll be, because the more people will be with the team, both from content side and team side, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think just for the prosperity of the ecosystem as well, I think it would be good to have more online play. So I'm very curious to your point, to the new normal, maybe a bit more online with some land feel. What we did in London with the studio, I think, is another good take on it not having to be a massive arena event. And then you can have the big arena events when it truly matters, right?
Right.
I'd rather prefer 2, 3 massive tentpole events that can draw even bigger crowds, because, everyone is so wired to go into an arena, rather than, a saturation of arena events, because that'll lose its glamour at some point as well.
Nicholas, we appreciate you very much, and for you coming on the show. We will be right back. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the other stuff going on in Counter-Strike, so stay tuned here for the Eco on the ESPN Esports Twitch channel. Welcome back to the Eco, and before we hop off, I want to talk a little bit about Astralis. You would know, if you've watched the show previously, that we have had Casper Vitt on this show. He is the director of sport at Astralis, and we did talk to him about the burnout that's been going on with Glaive and Zipnix on his team and what they're doing about it. Recently, a Richard Lewis article came to light that he wrote, and I wanted to talk a little bit about it. If you didn't read sort of the synopsis of the piece, was the fact that at first, because of the pandemic, that Astralis allegedly asked their players to take a 30% pay cut. That's the big one. It's huge, entirely important to the rest of this piece. From there, it breaks down sort of the fact that many of the players that have taken leave from Astralis both have asked to take break and have seen a doctor and been diagnosed with some sort of burnout. And the fact that they're able to take off time, and we've seen Astralis sort of pivot and market as this 10-man roster. And also, Richard talked a little bit about their PR strategy around the fact that they are a public company. That's a lot to break down. So I actually want to take the public company one first. I've been a business reporter for a while, and in learning about stocks and trade and everything else, I have zero idea why any esports team, unspecific to Astralis Group, why any esports team would be an IPO, no matter the country. Look, I get it, right? I understand. Astralis is a massive company in Denmark. Denmark is a country that, other than soccer, doesn't have a lot of massive sports. And if you look at Astralis' history in that country, they've met with the prime minister multiple times. They're written about in the papers all the time. They are a big part of the culture there. So yeah, from a money-making perspective, if you're a shareholder of Astralis, one of the founders, or someone else who owns equity in there, it makes a lot of sense for you to be an IPO, to launch an initial public offering. But from a long-term perspective, I've always questioned why a team would do this right now. A lot of teams in sports actually aren't publicly owned, if you look at it. There are some, like the New York Knicks via the Madison Square Garden company, although recently spun off to a separate organization. But that's usually a parent company that also owns things like venues. A lot of esports teams don't have that. We've seen some teams try to do this. The case of Luminosity and EGLX, which is a Canadian tournament organizer, they've done this. But all these stocks are not trading for more than a couple bucks a pop. These aren't high-tier stocks at all. In some cases, they're penny stocks, which is certainly not good for this industry either. But Richard's point was the fact that now that they're a public company, all the eyes are on them because now they actually have shareholders in the public to answer to. And look, I deal with PR people all the time. It's in their best interest to spin things in favor of their client. I don't think that the people that work at the Astralis Group are any different in that regard. They just work there full time. So talking about that is important, but more generally, I don't understand why they're an IPO. And certainly every stock in the world is having, or most stocks in the world right now are having issues because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that people just don't have money to spend and they're selling their stocks. The other part of this, the more important part about this, is that 30% pay cut. That would explain a lot of the fact why we've seen a lot of different things in flux with this team. Zivnix, with Glaive, even with some of their other teams. Asking players to take a 30% pay cut is rough, especially when you're one of the leading organizations and one of the winningest organizations in the entire industry. Astralis proclaims itself to be a sort of beacon for all of esports. That's what they have marketed themselves as. So doing this, and trust me, they're not alone. There are other esports teams who want to scale back and are scaling back. But in many cases, they're having to pay to get out of agreements. That's not what's happening here. So when I look at what's going on with Astralis, I don't know what the future is going to be for them. I can tell you, I don't think we're going to see Glaive or Zipnix come back at the end of their 3-month tenure. I think they may come back eventually, and they may be a part of this team. They have a lot of stake in being a part of this team from a marketing perspective, from a brand perspective. They are Astralis because they've been there since the beginning. And if you remember, there was a whole deal about them being co-owners also in the case of Zipnix, the original set of 5 players that established this team after they left TSM. But to me, the moves, the way they're being marketed is a little off. The Counter-Strike Professional Players Association putting out a statement the same day that one of the players took leave is also a little off. And I would ask that everyone sort of challenges these things a little critically. I think that a lot of people, depending on who you read or who you watch, you may be incredibly critical of Astralis because there are certain content creators in our space who like to criticize them very frequently. But in this case, I think it's probably fair game. So as a journalist, this is something I'm definitely going to be looking more into over the next couple of weeks. There's a lot of stuff going on in Counter-Strike right now that needs good reporters and hard-nosed reporters without any sort of ties. And I certainly hope to help contribute to that. I like the community and yeah, certainly hold some people to account. So with that, we'll sign off with the show. But think critically in these times. So thank you for joining us on the Eco this week. It's been a pleasure. We will be back next week, same time, Monday, 9 p.m. Eastern time, here on Twitch, on Twitter, other platforms also. So stay tuned to ESPN Esports. On Twitter, we're at ESPN_esports. I'm at Jacob Wolf. On Twitch, we are twitch.tv/ESPN Esports. Thanks for joining us.